You and I have now walked through the importance of understanding soil health. You also know that I mentioned doing things like getting a soil test and a decomposition test. So today, I'm going to share with you how you are all the expert your soil needs and the steps needed to complete both of these tests. Let's get growing. Hello and welcome to the Pray Just Plant podcast, the show that talks about growing a garden, a homestead, a healthy family, and most importantly, growing closer to God. I'm your host, Crystal Media, owner of the Red Ridge Farm Homestead, where our mission is to help women of faith find the courage to grow healthy food for their family while building a closer relationship with our Lord and Savior. If that's you, don't let the world hold you back. Pray, just plant. Welcome to the Pray Just Plant podcast. I'm your host, Crystal Media, and today in episode 2, season 5, we're going to talk about soil testing and how you are that expert your soil needs. First of all, I just want to say that this episode is building up on a series of episodes that I've done before. I think we've got 2 more to come on this same topic. So if you feel like maybe you're getting into the middle of something, you kind of are. Just make sure you go back and check out the previous episodes, season 2, episode 1, what is soil health? And season 2, episode 3, what is the ideal soil for my garden? So now that I have that kind of out of the way, let's get down to our topic. If you've listened to those previous episodes, you and I have now walked through the importance of understanding soil health. You also know that I mentioned and I really discussed the importance of a soil test and a decomposition test and how those work together to test the 2 different ways to test soil health. And that is what your soil produces is one way that we can test soil health. And the microorganisms in your soil is another way that we can test soil health. And so the soil test, which is a professional nutrient pH test, tests that element of what our soil can produce. Because if we go back to that connection that our plants are what the soil produces, then we can see that what our plant needs, those 15 micronutrients that our plants need to be in our soil so that we can produce healthy plants. The other one is the decomposition test. And that's a test that's going to measure those living organisms in your soil. But I want to make sure you understand that these tests, they sound huge, they sound big, but don't let that overwhelm of, I can't do this, creep in. That little voice telling you that you could never do them because you're not an expert, or saying soil tests are expensive. I just don't have the money right now. That voice is saying, I decided to start a garden to save money, not waste it. And I hear you. I hear that you could feel those things. And the reason I know you can feel those things is because I've felt them too. That same voice, those same questions are what I asked myself. And I had that powerless feeling because I didn't feel like I could be the expert of my soil. I knew I wanted to improve my soil, and I knew that I needed to get it done, but I was stuck in that feeling of overwhelm, thinking that I needed someone else to do it for me. I needed someone else to do the test for me. I needed someone else to read the test for me. So I just avoided it. A nutrient test, a decomposition test is the solution to improving your soil health, but I avoided it because I didn't feel like I could do it. And I know sometimes you may feel that same way. And so I did things like guessing at the solution instead of actually fixing the problem. I've told you in the previous episodes that I linked to that I told you that I depended on those experts, those other people that I found in books, those other people that I found on YouTube, those other people that I found on Mr. Google Pants, is what I call Google. I've depended on those other experts to tell me what my soil needed. But after all of those years of doing what others did, it didn't help my soil. It actually harmed my soil, and it actually began to lock up nutrients that were already there. Why were they already there? Why didn't I know they were already there? Is because I avoided those tests. And because I felt that those tests were so hard or so expensive and that I wasn't qualified, and that I might screw things up and make it worse, or that I'd be wasting money. I thought a professional test had to be way more expensive than those cheap tests from my local garden center. So instead of doing a professional soil test, I have a little story for you. So I have been gardening now for, this spring is going to be the beginning of 18 years that I have been gardening, and running a homestead. And that is a lot of time. But it's a lot of time to learn who I am and to learn to grow, not only grow food, but also to grow as a person. So when I first started growing a garden, my focus was to get it done. My focus was that I wasn't an expert. I was just learning. I needed to get the seeds planted. I needed to harvest. I needed to preserve. I was learning. I was in the mode of learning. And when you're in that mode of learning, sometimes you stop at moving beyond that. And so you're in that mode of learning, you're learning how to do things, and you're learning everything new. Then when it comes to something hard, like a soil test, you bulk at it because you're already doing hard things. You're already planting for the first time. You're already preserving your own food for the first time. You're already running chickens for the first time, and you have all this new stuff that's learning, that you let the little things that seem even more hard than the new things that you're learning, you let them slip away. And then the next stage you kind of go through is you're not so much more learning. You go into a stage of like, I got this. I know how to do it. I've done all the research. I figured this out, and I've got these things. I've learned how to do these things. Then I can learn how to do this hard thing, and I can do it myself. That was the next step I went into about 5 years after I started my garden. And so the first thing I went to were those cheap little tests with their pills and tarts and colors that you can get at the big box store, because I tried to be cheap. And I thought, they're selling these tests, so they must be easy to use. So this isn't me having to learn more things, because I was evolving out of the learning into the just doing it, getting it done, getting more things done so I could add more to my homestead. So for that next 5 years, I just used those cheap tests, and I guessed, and I did both things. I depended on what the expert said. I did those tests that really didn't help me out. If you've ever tried to use them, they are so confusing and so a waste of your money. They're just a waste of money. They're awful, they're hard to use, plus they're not really reliable because they only test the big three: nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And if you get into and read my book, Dirt, Finding the Solution to Soil Health, there's about 15 micronutrients, including nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, that your plants need. And I'm going to show you also in a few episodes from now that's only 3%. Those 15 micronutrients are actually in the 3% of all the things that your plants need. It's very minimal. And then if you only do those 3 out of the 15, it's very, very minimal what those testing for. It doesn't give the full picture so that your soil needs to contain to provide it for your plants. It's just a very small picture. And so I wasted money on those cheap little things, way more than I would have spent on 10 professional tests. And then at about 5-6 years ago, I hit where I wasn't really I was learning more, but I didn't have to survive on what I was learning. So things started to fall into place. And things I had learned about 10 years ago were becoming simple tasks. So they were things that I was remembering to do. Everything was moving forward. So I began to look back at my gardening journey, and the big thing that kept pulling me down and that kept really firing those red lights at me were my soil. It was maintaining, but it wasn't improving. And every year, I'd always tell my husband, he jokes with me all the time. He'd tell me that, you said we're going to no-till this year. And I was like, yeah, we're going to no-till. And he goes, why am I tilling? That's another story to go into. But it's that idea of where you need to go. It's that pivotal moment in your life of something that you look back and you realize that you were trying to go somewhere with this learning. You were trying to use what you learned to go there, but you were too busy doing other things, too busy trying to just learn and actually put that learning into action, that some things got left behind. And so I got to look back and really see that my soil and what I was doing to my soil, the things that I was listening to those other experts using those little cheap things, wasn't working. It just wasn't working. And so that's when I finally bit the bullet, if you want to say that, grab the bull by the horns, whichever you want to say. I finally stepped out of my worry. I stepped out of my inner talk, and I actually got a soil test done. It was just so easy to do both of these tests that I'm going to easily walk through all the steps with you today. And I just want to say really quick that once I started testing my soil regularly with a proper professional test, my soil began to become an open book. I began to see why listening to those experts was so detrimental, why it was so wrong for me. I was adding things to my soil that was already there and avoiding amendments that my soil desperately needed. I finally found that locksmith that could connect me to the keys in my soil. I tell a story last episode that was talking about how my tomatoes were looking at the nutrients in my soil like a person looks at the keys are in the ignition and the door is locked. And in that story, I talk about how that soil test truly let me see what was in that soil, see what my plants were lacking so that they could actually go for what they needed. And so that soil test, like I just said, was like that locksmith that I needed to help unlock those keys from my car, help me unlock that nutrients that was already in my soil. So I'm going to tell you about the ins and outs of collecting samples for a professional soil test, and we're going to talk about a decomposition test. But first, it is time for the weekly tips and tricks of this episode, where I share a bonus tip and trick that I use here at Red Ridge Farm. So this week's tip is brought to you by the Soil Handbook. This is a handbook that I designed to help you find those steps you need to improving your soil health. You can find this handbook at www.redridgefarm.org/resources, or you can go to the link in the description of this episode. So the tip for this week is amend your soil. So we're talking about soil testing, and the time of this episode is going to be late April. Last couple episodes ago, I said, get your soil test. That was my tip. And this week is to get your amendments figured out and figure out if those amendments can be something you can plant, like in a cover crop. And I covers a lot of those different ideas in the soil handbook, or you need to purchase amendments. I talk very deeply about the importance of using natural amendments. Now, the reason I use the word natural and not organic is because organic comes from plants or dead plants. Natural is going to also include your amendments that come from rocks, like rock phosphate, and other minerals like calcium, and things that come from the soil itself. So when I say it's time to figure out your amendments, your natural amendments, I mean both of those things. So now that we've discussed in depth how you can be that expert, how I felt like I wasn't that expert and it held me back from doing my soil tests, and how I went through that journey of about 18 years that it took me to go from learning to looking back to actually doing. So the first test you would do would be the nutrient soil test. This measures the nutrients, those micronutrients in your soil, and it also measures your pH. So this test will tell you what nutrients are in your soil, and then you can compare this list that's in your soil to the list of 15 micronutrients that your plants required. Remember, we talked about how one way that soil health is measured is by what your plants need, or what the soil needs to produce a plant. This test is going to help you connect those two lists. And this test will also give you a base to go forward. Like I said before, finding out what the ideal soil is, and you can listen to episode 3 of this season that talks about the ideal soil. finding out what that is like a goal. You are finding your goal of where you want your soil to go. But if you don't have a test, and I'm going to give you the instructions for how to do that, this test is going to help you have a baseline to move towards that goal. So the very first thing you want to do is you want to find a local facility in your area. So the easiest way to do that is ask Mr. Google Pants for soil test facilities in your area. They're going to give you a list. So if you don't have one exactly in your city, go out about 300 miles to some other cities because soil samples can be mailed, and find one there. So I found one at my local feed store. So feed stores might be an option for you to look at. Labs might be an option for you to look at. Usually places that test water will also test soil. So once you have your list of these people that you can get a soil test from, because you're going to get them from a lab, you need to get in on the details of it. So you need to call them, or you need to go to their website. I know when I found about two of them, I looked at their website, told me what they were testing for. Just make sure that they're testing for nutrients levels and pH. So make sure you call them and get all the details of how they want the samples. Like, do they want them in plastic bags? How much do they want? Do they need to have special labeling? You're going to find all that stuff out way before you even get out in the garden and do a sample. Step number 1 is ask Mr. Google Pants and find a lab. And then step number 2 is research those labs and find out which ones are going to, what kind of guidelines they're going to give you. And then step number 3 is to collect your soil sample. So I suggest too that you do multiple areas in your garden. So for instance, last year I sent off 4 samples, one from my pasture. And the reason I did this, it was my husband's idea. It was a brilliant idea, is because I have not been amending and messing with the pasture soil, even though it's only 15, 20 feet from my garden. I haven't been adding compost to it. I haven't been adding any amendments to it. So it gave me a really good baseline as to where I was moving from. So you don't have to do that, but that's just something I did, and it was a brilliant idea. I did the other 3 from different parts of my garden. I did a couple samples from my raised beds, and the reason I did that is because I treat them differently, because I'm kind of doing an experiment where I'm using a little bit of natural soil, and then mostly compost is what I put in every year to top off my beds instead of putting more soil in. I'm running an experiment there, so I get a couple tests from there. And then I have my northwest beds. This was a garden that I established 3 years ago. I want to know how it's progressing, and also because it's going to be different than a garden that I established 18 years ago. It's a way for me to keep track of all of those different things, because I've told you before, when you're doing soil health, it's really hard to measure the Amazon forest to your backyard. It's really hard to measure a 15-year-old garden to a 2-year-old garden. The soil's going to be different. The maturity of the soil is going to be different. Try to keep the samples separate in my lab report. And it just helps me show an evolution of my soil. Having that pasture one, I'd never really done this before, but it made me feel good to see that what I was doing in my garden wasn't all bad. I was improving it, because the pasture had pretty much no organic matter. It was very low in nitrogen, very low in a lot of things. And so it really gave me something to look at and show me that I was improving my soil, and that since I've been doing these soil tests, I've been really improving my soil. I want you to make sure you get different samples from different areas of your garden and make sure you label them. So to gather your sample, you're going to need a clean shovel, or what I like to use is a stainless steel bulb planter. It's like a tube with 2 little paddles that you can step on and push into the soil. And you want to make sure both of these are clean of any other debris, because you're trying to get a sample of those certain areas in your garden. You're going to need plastic resealable bags for each sample. You're going to need a permanent marker. And then if you're using a shovel, you want to dig a hole that is at least 6 inches deep and about as wide as your shovel. And then you're going to take your shovel and just shave off inside that hole about 3 inches portion of the hole. And then you're going to put that soil in a bag and make sure you label it. Now, if you're using the bulb planter, you're going to press that bulb planter. I have one with a long handle on it so I can actually hold it in my hands and push it in almost just like a shovel. So I push that in and then it goes down about 6 inches deep, and then I press the core out of this tube and I send that, it's a circular part of the planter, and I push a plug of soil out of it and place that whole plug in the plastic label, because you want to make sure that you're getting the top layer soil and you're also getting that 6 inches below the soil. You want that whole spectrum. You want that whole piece from top to bottom, from 0 inches to 6 inches. They want that whole piece. Use that plug. You just put that in the plastic bag and you label it. And when you label it, you want to make sure you put the date, the bed you took the sample from. Like, I've always dreamed of naming my beds like George Washington or Thomas Jefferson, but I can never remember that. I use things like southeast because the directions never change. So I have my southwest beds, my east beds. So I label that, and then you want your name on there. So just in case the professionals, they get all your samples out and they move them away from your box. That's what I just picture, is they're moving around the lab with their little bags and stuff, that it's still all connected. Your name's on there. They can't mess up the name. I don't know. That's just what I picture. So then that comes to our fourth step, which is to turn in your samples to your testing facility. So if you're going to be mailing them, you're going to need a box, you're going to need packing tape, the address of the testing facility, and any other guidelines, like if they need special labels. I don't see that they do, but if they did, then they should provide those for you. And then the last fifth step, which we're not going to cover today, is going to be go over your results. It's very important to go over those results. And if you would like to learn more about how I read my results, or more about this building your soil health, then you can check out my Soil is Your Foundation Masterclass. You can also find that in the link www.redridgefarm.org/resources, or in a link that I'll put in the description box. So now that we've talked about the first test, I'm going to talk about the decomposition test. But before we get to that, it's time for the Growing with God segment of this episode, where we talk about growing a relationship with our Lord and Savior. So the verse we're going to be talking about today is Proverbs 3:5-6. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to Him, and He will make your path straight. It is very easy in this day and age, and especially when we are on our growing journey, to forget who put us on this journey, and that we need to lean on the master of our journey. We need to lean and trust in our Lord with all our heart, and lean not on our own understanding. Things happen in this world that are beyond our understanding. Now that I look back on my soil journey, I can see why things happen the way they did. But when we're in the moment, we can't see that. When we're in the moment of a frustration with our child, we're in the moment of dealing with a heartache that's of something that happened on the homestead, or just dealing with the fatigue of growing our own food and growing a healthy family, we're too much in the moment. We don't see the future. We don't see what the past. We're so much in the moment that is when we need to submit to Him, because He has already made that path, and He's going to make it straight. And where is it going? It's going straight to Him. Our path is to Him. Our path of our children is to Him. So when we are in that drudgery of trying to keep that connection with our Lord, and trying to keep that connection with the land and grow our own food, and also a home. I mean, homesteading, home is the first part of it. When we're struggling in doing dishes, I hate doing dishes. It's then that we need to not rely on my hate of doing dishes, not relying on my own understanding, but that I need to submit to him. I need to dedicate what I don't enjoy doing, even though it needs to be done, to him. He's the one who gave us the kids to feed. He's the one who has helped us grow this tasty food. So people to feed and tasty food, it equals dirty dishes. That's just the way it is. And so when we take heart and we lean not on ourselves for strength, but submit to him and trust in him, he's going to make our path straight. And it's going to be a path we don't think is straight, but it is, because it's going straight to him. So just remember this week to trust in the Lord with all your heart. Lean not on your understanding, and in all your ways submit to him, and he will make your path straight. Proverbs 3:5-6. So let's get back to soil testing and soil health. So we've talked about how we measure soil health two ways. We've talked about how it's measured with what our soil produces, the plant, and then that plant is connected to the nutrients it needs to survive, or ideal soil. And then we test our nutrients and our pH level so that we can make that environment good for our plant. And it's that nutrient cycle. It's a cycle of the soil needs to have the nutrients for the plant to grow and do its thing, and then we need to make sure we replace those nutrients so that the plant can grow, and then replace, measure, grow, replace, measure, grow. Okay, so here we're going to talk about, in this next test, we're going to talk about the decomposition cycle. So we've talked about that soil is an ecosystem, and with every ecosystem it has cycles. So we have the nitrogen cycle, we have the water cycle, we have the carbon cycle. So we talked about before how that carbon cycle, there's two types of carbon cycles. There's the one with the dinosaurs and the diamonds that take lots and lots of years, or there's the compost or the decomposition carbon cycle that is happening right now. It's happening today. It's happening in my garden right now. It's happening in the best place to find it is your compost pile. And this carbon cycle is connected to the microorganisms, because the microorganisms, they breathe, and that's the respiration that the soil gives. They do things, and what do? They decompose things in the soil. That's what they eat. So we can measure how well they're doing by measuring what they're doing, right? If a organism has everything it needs to live, reproduce, then it also has the next thing it needs to do is do its work. So everything has a job in this cycle that God has made us. Those microorganisms, they decompose as their job. And that's how we can measure them, is by measuring their job, how well that job is being done in our soil. So measuring life in your soil may seem like a really daunting task. And you may be wondering, how do you measure decomposition? Well, there was this fellow named Bill Robertson. He came up with an ingenious idea. It might surprise you, but he is a soil scientist at the University of Arkansas, and he developed a test that he likes to call the Soil Your Undies test. Yep, that's what I said. Soil Your Undies test. This test involves burying a pair of men's cotton white underwear 6 inches under the soil and leaving the waistband visible so that you can come back in about 5 to 6 weeks to see how well your underwear has decomposed. So here's a quote from him. Soil creatures, bacteria, fungi, and microorganisms eat cellulose, and those briefs are basically cellulose. If that soil is alive, then after 5 weeks, the underwear should fall apart like a wet newspaper. If, on the other hand, the soil isn't thriving, then what is left is dirty but intact set of briefs. Bill Robertson. So that's his theory about this, that cotton is essentially cellulose or plants. So these microorganisms, if they are reproducing and getting the food they need and breaking stuff down in the soil, they're going to break down these undies too. So the only things you're going to need for this test is 1 pair of white men's cotton underwear. You can use more than one if you want to test different areas, and I totally suggest that you do, because there could be certain areas that may have gotten more compost than you thought or less compost than you thought. And it will help you give an overall picture of your garden. So buying a simple pack, you can buy a pack, test 3 different places, and then if you have 3 more, you can test 3 different places the next year. And then you're also going to need a shovel. So step 1 is to buy and wash your undies, because you want to make sure you get 100% cotton, and you also want to make sure that when you wash them with hot water, you're just trying to remove any chemical residue that can come from the material during shipping, during manufacturing, during all of that process. And you want to make sure that the band is not cotton so that you can at least find the band when you do go back to examine your test. So then you want to find an area in your garden or in your wherever you want to test the life in your soil and leave it undisturbed for about 5 weeks. So you want to dig a 6-inch deep hole, bury the undies with the waistband showing, or you can put a stake of some kind to mark it so that you can come back in 5 weeks. Because I promise you, you will not remember the exact place where it goes. Landscape changes with a storm. It changes very quickly. Landscape changes very quickly. So you just want to make sure you mark it in some way. And then you want to choose the proper time to test your soil, because remember, these are living organisms. So early in the spring, this is going to be late April that this is airing. Early in the spring, your soil is going to be more cold. It's not saying that the microorganisms aren't there, but they're not going to be working hard doing decomposition because they're still too busy just surviving. They're too busy. They're just eating. They're just reproducing. They're just surviving. And then once your soil warms up a little bit, probably in mid to late summer and fall is the perfect time to do this, because you know the soil is warm enough, you know it's not too hot, you know it's not too cold. It's just important that if you do compare one year to another year, or you're looking at your results, you want to make sure you keep an idea of when you started the test. Because it could go like, if I started it, say the beginning of April. Now this is zone 4 for me. If I started this test and as soon as the soil was turnable, that I could dig a hole, it wasn't frozen anymore, I'm going to have a couple weeks of dormancy because those microorganisms aren't working as hard. And then I'll probably have 3 weeks of good measure. So maybe I could leave it in the soil 7 weeks if I did it that way. But you just want to make sure you've got about 5 weeks of where it's not too cold and it's not too hot, and probably late spring would be perfect, early summer. And just remember that when you test, that you did take that into account. And you also, if you do multiple tests, like every year, you test at the same time. So mark it in your calendar, like you bury it on April 15th, and then you dig it up 5 weeks later. And you do the same thing the next year. So you're comparing the same microorganisms to the same microorganisms, the same climate of the microorganisms to the same climate of the microorganisms. I personally do my test in late spring. So you want to bury those undies 6 inches underneath the soil. You can either leave like I said, you can leave the band visible, or you can mark it. And then you wait your 5 weeks, and then you measure the amount of decomposition. So underwear that is only has the band remaining is your goal, but any level of decomposition result is good, because that means there's microorganisms in your soil breaking it down. So even if you get a little bit of decomposition on those undies, it's a good thing for your soil. That means you have a point to start at and a goal to get to. So I also want you, when you're thinking about all of this information that I gave you, all of these things, and you that voice comes back that you might feel overwhelmed about doing these tests, I want you to remember a quote. I shared this quote a couple episodes ago, but it's by Elliot Coleman. And Elliot Coleman is a market gardener that grows up, I believe, in Maine. He's grown a market garden, I think he's on like 40 years or 30 years. It's a lot of books. I read a lot of his books. I've learned so much from him. But one quote that he had was, "Almost any soil can be made productive for growing crops. The difference lies in the effort needed to make it so." So any effort you do to try to improve your soil health is going to do it. You don't need to let that voice come in and say that you're not the expert. because it's not true. You can only be the expert, because even though Elliot Coleman is someone that I can look up to, he grows in Maine. That is totally different soil. It's totally different situation that I'm dealing with. But I need to take in what he says and compare it to my own soil. I need to say what he says and figure out my own path with it. And to find your path, that's what I'm trying to show you today, and to really help you with is these tests are going to help you find a starting point for this path, this starting point for how much effort you're going to need to put into improving your soil health. It's going to be that first step up the mountain. I'm not going to tell you that building your soil health is easy and simple. It's going to take some time. It's going to take some effort, but I know you can do it. I know that you can be the expert of your own soil. It's just going to take laying those blocks in order to get where you need to go. And if you go back and listen to what I talk about with building your ideal soil, and when I talk about the importance of building your soil health, or even reading my book, Dirt, Finding the Solution to Building Your Soil Health, it's going to take you on that path. These soil tests are going to help you at the beginning, and then that information will take you on that path of getting to the soil health that your plants need. And that path is going to be long, because as I've also told you, soil is an ecosystem that takes time, but I know you can do it. You need to start your journey by doing these 2 simple tests. So just to recap really fast, soil health can be measured in 2 ways. The first test is doing a nutrient pH test, and you do that very quickly by Mr. Google Pants will help you find a lab in your area. Remember, 300 miles. Number 2, you need to research the lab, decide on which one you're going to go with. Number 3 is gather your samples. Number 4 is mail off those samples or do the next step, whatever your lab requires you to do. And number 5 is read those results. And then the next step you need to do is you need to do a decomposition test, and you do that by doing a Soil My Undies test, which means you just bury a pair of clean cotton underwear, and you see what the life in your soil does to it, what work they do on those undies. And always remember, whenever you feel that overwhelm creeping in, that this might seem too hard, let me just tell you that it is going to be hard, but you are ready to do hard things. I want to thank you for joining me here at the Pray Just Plant podcast. And if this is your first time listening, then I want to welcome you to the Red Ridge Farm community of fellow growers. And as always, don't let the world hold you back. Pray, just plant.